Okay, it's time for 1861 Summer 2 Action Phase 2. Here's the initiative dice roll. What do we got? Ooh, we got a tie. So both sides are going to draw a special action card. We got to do it again. And it looks like the Confederates by 2. Okay. So the South has the initiative with 2 activation points. It's both good and bad. There's no particular goal that Southern forces have this turn. They can't really press the Federal troops on any points. A couple things that can happen, and I want to say too, these low dice differential turns are really excellent for the Southern player. They're what he wants to see, because this is a game where the Confederates are fighting the clock just as much as they're fighting Northern troops. The Northern player will have a significant advantage in manpower, and the more they're able to press the attack, the more that they're going to stretch Southern forces thin and force them to take defensive positions and move back into the South and out of border states. That can vary. Your experience may vary depending upon the ability of players and how well you're rolling, but that's the sort of overarching trend that's going to develop in most games. So by denying the Northern player mini activation points, it makes them harder and harder. It makes it harder and harder for that player to get anything done, really. So last turn, we had 5 activations. That was not ideal for the Southern player. He wants really as few as possible. And essentially the difference between a 2 activation phase and a 4 activation phase is kind of like an extra activation phase, really. I mean, if you could have a 1 die roll differential versus a 5, of course that's ideal as the Southern player. But there are a couple things that we can do to take advantage of these 2 activation points that we have. First of all, this 1 SP here in Richmond is finally going to make its way up to Longstreet and reinforce him. So we'll just flip this chit over to its 4 side. I don't really think we need to put any more there. There's no real overarching need to do so. And then we have 1 more activation point. So it's tempting to fortify that 1 SP on the Arkansas-Missouri border, but from the perspective of the Southern player, I'm really sort of indifferent about Curtis attacking it. If he does attack it, he won't be able to move beyond that hex, even if he wins, and it would give Price an opportunity to get back to Fayetteville or take the initiative and attack Curtis if Curtis maybe loses an SP there and is particularly weakened. And he might give up Springfield in doing that, but he might still gain some sort of strategic initiative by doing so. But at the moment, I'm not sure that I really want to spend an activation point fortifying that SP, nor moving that SP out of the marshes in northeastern Arkansas. It's actually doing more there through its potential movement in later turns than it is through its position now, or any position it could take during this half of this action phase. What I would like to do is reposition some of these troops that are along the southern border, along the Gulf and the South Atlantic, that I placed at the end of the last turn during the reinforcement phase. The idea of placing them in ports that are currently unprotected to keep the Union from simply walking in unopposed, and into some of these fortresses too, just to make sure. We're going to have to try to find a way, the Southern player is going to have to try to find a way to sort of eke out a couple activations every cycle, or every turn for the first few turns, just to counteract rising Union naval forces and amphibious invasion capacity and protect its blockade levels. So there are a number of places where we can move some of these troops around, and just looking at some of the most susceptible places to invasion, certainly these ports along the Florida-Georgia coast, like Fernandina, Brunswick. We can take this 1 SP off out of Jacksonville, for instance, and put them in either Fernandina or Brunswick. But Jacksonville, because it's a resource hex, is a little bit more valuable than either of those. So I'll leave that 1 SP in Jacksonville, and we can actually reposition militia for free during our half of the action phase, just at will. So Fernandina and Brunswick, as far as I'm concerned, they're sort of equally created, so we'll just move him right up there. So we have 2 SPs in Mobile Bay that are entrenched there. We don't need to move them into Fort Morgan. It's really unnecessary to do so because the Southern player is allowed to freely move troops between coastal fortresses and their associated ports whenever the Union attacks them. It's assumed that the reaction is immediately successful, and other than adhering to a 3 SP stacking limit in a coastal fortress, then the Confederate player can move any troops that he wants. The reason that they're in Mobile Bay and not Fort Morgan is just because they just happen to start there. There are places that we would like to perhaps move some troops that this is not the case, however, one of these being Ship Island. To get them to Ship Island, we would, however, have to use a naval card in addition to movement. So along the southern coast, as everything is currently laid out, the only units that we might really want to move are these 2 here in Charleston. We're going to want to break these down, or at least I've decided to break them down. To leave 1 in Charleston, I'm going to move 1 over towards Port Royal. So that would be 2, 4, or 1, 2, 4 would get him almost there. Not quite, but he'll get them there on the next turn. So those are the Southern player's 2 activations. Let's see what the Union has in store. So this is one of those examples where the Union would like to have had more than 2 activations. There are a number of things they would like to do. They'd like to challenge Price in Springfield, and they have the activations to do that. Curtis can move up, try to get some guys from Fremont, and move to Springfield. Halleck couldn't challenge Johnston the same turn that happened, however, because you see that red box around his movement point number. That indicates that you would need 2 activations to activate him. We could use a special action card to do that, to make up for the shortfall. If we had a Trans-Mississippi card, we do not. We have an East card and a Naval card. In the east, we would like to send Burnside and McDowell east towards Staunton. With only 2 activations, we could only send... we could send both of them there, but then move nowhere else and not attack in Springfield. And if we look down at the status track and the turn record track, we see that this turn the Union wants to finish with 4 victory points. And they already have 4 victory points. So the spur's not really to them yet. They're not running behind or anything. They don't have any territory to make up for in terms of the historical performance of the Union. But, nevertheless, they'd still like to make as much progress as they could whenever they could, because you never know how well those dice differentials are going to roll in the future. So I think one of the things we're definitely going to do is Curtis is going to try to take Price out. So he can do that by expending a movement point to move up to the east side of Springfield, and then using another movement point he can sort of pull troops out of Fremont stack. He has to leave at least 1 there, but Price knows this. So Curtis with his 2 SP are going to move to 2306 with the view of taking 3 of Fremont's SP and then moving on to Springfield. But Price isn't stupid. He knows this. And he knows that he would be at a disadvantage if he were to take on 5 SPs plus 1 modifier versus 3 plus 2, as opposed to 3 with his 1 defensive modifier versus Curtis's 2 with a 1 offensive modifier. So he's going to try to intercept outside of Springfield. So let's roll some dice and see how he does here with his interception roll. He gets to add 1 to this roll. Doesn't do it. Okay, so Curtis gets in there. He gets 3 of Fremont's SPs, and then he's going to move on Springfield with 5 SPs. So now Price has the opportunity to either defend the hex or to attempt to avoid the battle. If he tries to avoid the battle, he may or may not succeed, but if he fails in avoiding the battle, he'll nevertheless lose his fortification bonus if he fails. So that would be a significant disadvantage, so he needs to weigh the pros and cons here. Price has a pretty good chance of successfully defending here, and it's certainly a lot less risky to do that than to try to run out of Springfield. So we're going to roll a couple dice here and see how this battle turns out. Okay, so the Confederate troops roll a 6 plus 3, and that's opposed to the Union troops 5 plus 1. You'll see that the 6 on the 3 column plus 3 gives us a 9 result. This maxes out at 1 star. Meanwhile, the Federal troops rolled a 5 plus 1, which gives them a 6 result on 1, which also gives them a 1 star. So we have a tied battle here. Both stacks are out of full supply, so both stacks become demoralized, and both stacks will lose 1 SB. And in the east, actually, we're going to move McDowell. So McDowell moved 2, and then he will use 2 movement points to fortify his position.